It was a Tuesday in 1883, maybe 1882. The records aren't precise about the exact year, only the decade. The Sisters of Nazareth Convent in the center of Nazareth, a small religious house built on a hillside, needed some routine maintenance done on the lower floors. One of the nuns, probably a lay sister assigned to the kind of work that doesn't make it into hagiographies, was clearing rubble from a storage area when her tool hit something that didn't sound right. Not soil, not loose stone, something else. A wall. Not a new wall. An old one. Older than the convent. Older, it would turn out, than anything anyone in that building expected to find under their feet. Mère Giraud, the sister who took charge of what happened next, didn't call a government agency. There were no government agencies for this kind of thing in 1883, Ottoman-controlled Palestine. She did what any practical woman in charge of a religious house would do. She organized the community, found people willing to dig carefully, and they documented what they uncovered. Hand-drawn maps, written descriptions, a methodical record kept by women who had no formal archaeological training, but apparently had more patience and rigor than half the professional excavators working in the region at the time. What they found was a courtyard house, stone walls, carved into the natural bedrock on one side. 1st century in construction, in the center of Nazareth, on a hillside, matching, in almost every architectural detail, what we now know a well-built family home in 1st century Galilee would have looked like. I have thought about those nuns more than I should probably admit. I spent 12 years teaching world history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. Every single year, sometime in the fall semester, we covered the world of Jesus, the social context of 1st century Palestine, the economic conditions, the religious landscape, and every single year in every textbook I used, the visual representation of the Holy Family was the same. A rough stable, a dirt floor, figures wrapped in plain cloth, the absolute iconography of poverty. It wasn't presented as art. It wasn't presented as medieval devotional interpretation. It was presented as historical background, as context, as fact. I never questioned it. I was a history teacher who didn't question it. That bothers me now in a way I struggle to fully articulate. Because here's what was sitting in the archaeological record the whole time, completely accessible, written up in academic publications I could have found if I had looked. The ground under Nazareth tells a different story. And the ground under Capernaum, the town where Jesus moved as an adult, where the Gospels say he made his home during his ministry, tells a different story too. Not a story about wealth, not a story about privilege in any modern sense, but a story about skilled construction work, stone houses, families who knew how to build in a region that was, in the early 1st century, in the middle of a massive urban building project just a few miles down the road. I want to take you through what the dirt actually shows, not what tradition painted, what the spade uncovered. If this kind of investigation resonates with you, the kind where you go into a question thinking you know the answer and come out somewhere different, the subscribe button tells the algorithm to keep sending you this type of content. I have a lot more of these that won't let go of me. Let me back up. When I first started teaching, I inherited a curriculum. I didn't build it. Nobody builds a curriculum from scratch in their first year at a school that's been running since 1961. You receive a binder. You adapt, and somewhere in that binder, in the unit on the ancient world, was a section on daily life in 1st century Judea and Galilee, and the economic situation of ordinary Jewish families under Roman occupation. The picture the textbook painted was consistent. Roman occupation meant taxation. Taxation meant poverty. Poverty was the water that Jesus swam in. The logic made a certain kind of sense, and it wasn't entirely wrong. Roman taxation was real. Economic pressure on subject peoples was real. But the picture was flatter than the reality, and I didn't know enough at the time to push back on it. The word that started breaking the flatness for me was tekton. It's a Greek word. It appears twice in the New Testament in connection with Joseph and Jesus. Matthew's Gospel calls Jesus the tekton's son. Mark's Gospel calls Jesus himself the tekton. It gets translated in almost every English Bible you will pick up as carpenter. And here's the thing. That translation is not exactly wrong, but it is not exactly right either. And the difference matters more than I initially understood. A tekton in 1st century Galilee was not a furniture maker. The region doesn't have the forests for that kind of woodworking tradition, not in any significant scale. The word is better understood as someone who works with hard materials, stone, wood, whatever the building project requires. A craftsman, a builder, someone with specialized skill in construction. Closer to what we might call a stonemason or a master builder than a carpentry shop owner. Skilled labor in the ancient world was not the same as subsistence poverty. A tekton family would have been what sociologists studying the period now call artisan class. Not wealthy in any aristocratic sense, not destitute in the sense of day laborer with no certainty of tomorrow. Somewhere between those two things, with steady work when work was available. And in the early 1st century, in Lower Galilee, work was very available. I'm still not sure about exactly when Sepphoris began its expansion under Herod Antipas. Whether it was before or during Jesus' childhood, the dating is genuinely debated. But what is not debated is that Sepphoris, a Roman-style city with colonnaded streets and administrative buildings and all the infrastructure of Hellenistic urban planning, was under active construction throughout the first decades of the 1st century. And Sepphoris is approximately 4 miles from Nazareth. Less than an hour's walk. Think about that for a second. If your family specialized in stone construction and the nearest city was being rebuilt in Roman style from the ground up, the idea that you would spend those years in total destitution is not what the economic logic of the period suggests. I'm not saying Jesus was wealthy. I'm not saying his family was comfortable in any sense a modern person would recognize as comfort. I'm saying the picture of absolute poverty, of a craftsman family with no resources and no skills, is harder to maintain than the textbooks made it seem. And the reason that matters is because of what we've now found in the ground. Let me take you to Nazareth first, then to Capernaum. The Sisters of Nazareth Convent sits in the center of modern Nazareth, on the hill above the main market street. The building they constructed in the 19th century was built on top of, and partially incorporating, much older structures. This is not unusual in a city that has been continuously occupied for 2,000 years. In the ancient world, you built on top of what was already there. Foundations become basements. Basements become storage. Storage becomes forgotten. What Mère Giraud and her community found in the 1880s was the beginning of something that wouldn't be fully understood until Ken Dark, a British archaeologist and professor at the University of Reading, began a systematic study of the site in the 1990s and published his findings through 2 major works: his 2021 publication on the Sisters of Nazareth Convent site and his 2023 book specifically on the archaeology of Jesus' Nazareth. Dark's analysis of what the nuns discovered, and what he uncovered in subsequent layers, was careful in the way that good archaeology has to be careful. He didn't claim certainty where the evidence doesn't support certainty. What he described is this: a domestic structure from the 1st century, a courtyard house, partially cut into the natural limestone bedrock of the hillside, partially built up with stone walls, covering an area consistent with a family of moderate means. Not a palatial space, not a hovel. A house, a real house, built to last by people who knew how to build. The ceramics found in the fill and floor layers were consistent with a 1st century Jewish family. Limestone vessel fragments, which is important. Limestone doesn't absorb impurities, which made it the preferred material for ritual vessels among observant Jewish households. This wasn't a Roman household using Roman pottery. This was a Jewish household maintaining Jewish practice, the kind of household the Gospels describe. Dark was also careful about what the evidence cannot prove. There is no inscription, no carved name, no document that says, "The family of Joseph of Nazareth lived here." He has been explicit about this. What he has said, and this is the part that stays with me, is that the earliest Byzantine Christians apparently venerated this specific structure as the childhood home of Jesus. There are Byzantine structures built around it, incorporating it, protecting it. The early church called it the Church of the Nutrition, a reference to where Jesus was nourished and raised. They treated it as a sacred location while the memory of the place was still living. That's not proof. I want to be clear about that. But it is not nothing. I had almost let this go. There's a point in any investigation like this where you've read enough to know you're not going to get the clean answer, and that point is frustrating in a specific way. It's not the frustration of a dead end. It's the frustration of a door that keeps opening into another hallway. You think you've reached the room, and instead there's another corridor and another door. I remember sitting with Ken Dark's 2021 publication at about 2 in the morning. This was well after I'd left the school, probably a year and a half into the independent research phase, and feeling something close to fatigue. Not boredom, not disinterest. The specific exhaustion of someone who cares deeply about getting this right, and is starting to suspect that getting it right means living with a permanent degree of uncertainty. I closed the book, made tea, stood at the kitchen window for a while looking at my neighbor's street light, which had been flickering for about 3 weeks and nobody had called the city about. I remember that detail clearly because I remember what I was thinking. Maybe some things just stay uncertain. Maybe the house is a serious candidate, and the honest answer is serious candidate, and I need to be okay with that. And then I went back to my desk and opened the Capernaum file. Because I had not fully processed what happened in Capernaum. I had read about it in passing during earlier research, but I hadn't sat with it the way I'd sat with the Nazareth material. And Capernaum is different. What happened in Capernaum is not about a possible identification. It's about a documented transformation. The site that matters is under the octagonal Byzantine church on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, the one that now has a modern Catholic church suspended over it on metal columns so visitors can look down through glass floors at the excavation below. Virgilio Corbo and Stanislao Lafreda, Franciscan archaeologists, excavated systematically under that Byzantine structure beginning in the 1960s. Corbo's documentation was published in 1969. Lafreda's comprehensive account followed in 1985 in Recovering Capernaum. What they found was not what anyone expected to find under a major Byzantine martyrium. They found a 1st century private house, a domestic structure, stone walls from the early 1st century, a courtyard layout built in the style of the period, with no particular distinction that would separate it from other houses on that block. Except for one thing. At some point in the second half of the 1st century, within living memory of the crucifixion, this private house was converted into a public space. The walls were plastered. The floor was resurfaced. Pottery from before the conversion suggests a private family used the space. Pottery from after the conversion suggests many people were using it, not as a residence, but as a gathering place. The plaster walls had been written on, scratched graffiti in several languages, Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, some of which have been identified as early Christian devotional inscriptions, invocations of Jesus, references to Lord and Christ and Peter. This is inside a private house that was converted to a public gathering space within decades of Jesus' death. The tradition that came down through the Byzantine period identified this as the house of Peter, the house where, according to the Gospels, Jesus stayed during his ministry in Capernaum, healed Peter's mother-in-law, returned to regularly, made his operational base, in a sense, during the Galilee years. No name on the wall. No inscription that says Jesus slept here. The same epistemic caution I applied to Nazareth applies here. But when a private house in a specific neighborhood in the exact town where multiple independent sources say Jesus lived and worked is converted into a public Christian gathering space within living memory of the events, converted so quickly and so completely that the original domestic layers are sealed beneath the renovation. That is not a random coincidence waiting to be explained. That is a community doing something intentional with a place because they believe, within their own memory or one generation removed, that something happened there. The Byzantine Christians who eventually built the octagonal martyrium over the site in the 5th century, a major architectural investment, the kind of building that required patronage and planning, were not working from a vague legend. They were building on top of a structure that had already been a venerated Christian site for 400 years. 4 centuries of continuous practice in that specific building, on that specific property. This is where I have to be honest about something. Not about the archaeology. The archaeology is as solid as I've described it. I want to be honest about what happened to me when I put these 2 sites together. I had spent 12 years standing in a classroom in a Catholic institution, teaching students about the world of Jesus. I had used images from textbooks, the stable, the manger, the rough cloth, the absolute poverty, as historical background material, as context, not as medieval religious art, not as devotional construction, but as fact. I had implicitly told hundreds of students that this was what the historical record looked like. I was wrong. Not about everything, not catastrophically wrong, but wrong in the specific, consequential way that a teacher is wrong when they present an interpretation as established fact without checking whether the physical evidence actually supports it. The house in Nazareth was built by people who knew how to build. Stone cut from bedrock. Walls designed to last. A courtyard layout that speaks to a family with enough stability to think about permanence. The house in Capernaum was considered significant enough by the people who knew it within living memory to be immediately converted into a sacred space, and to stay that way continuously for 400 years until the Byzantines invested serious resources in formalizing what was already being practiced there. The iconography of the Nativity as I taught it, the absolute poverty, the stable as symbol of God choosing the lowest of the low, that is medieval devotional art making a theological argument. It is beautiful art, it is a powerful theological argument, but it is not what the archaeological record shows when you look at the actual physical evidence of where Jesus lived and worked and where the people who knew him gathered to remember him. No, wait. Let me be more precise than that, because I think imprecision here is its own kind of dishonesty. The medieval iconography is making a specific theological point, that Jesus chose to empty himself of privilege. That point can still be theologically meaningful, even if the historical house was made of good stone. The 2 things are not actually in contradiction, unless you have been teaching one of them as historical fact rather than theological interpretation, which is what I was doing. That distinction between the theological argument and the historical evidence is what I wasn't equipped to teach because nobody had taught it to me. The textbooks didn't make the distinction. The curriculum didn't make the distinction. The institution I worked for, the one whose job it was to help students think clearly about historical and theological questions, did not make the distinction. I remember a student, this was my 4th or 5th year teaching. So late 1990s, one of those classes where a few students actually engage with the material in a way that goes somewhere. He was asking about the parables, specifically about how often the parables involve construction. The man who built his house on rock versus sand, the tower that couldn't be finished because the builder didn't count the cost, the cornerstone that the builders rejected. He wanted to know why Jesus talked about construction so much. I didn't have a good answer. I said something about Jesus using imagery from everyday life, which is true, but incomplete. What I didn't say, because I didn't know, Jesus grew up in a household where construction was the professional vocabulary, where the quality of stone and the soundness of foundation and the difference between a building that lasts and one that collapses were things discussed at the dinner table. The construction parables don't just use everyday imagery, they might be using professional memory. They might be the parables of someone who spent his childhood watching his father and his family judge the quality of cut stone and the integrity of foundation work, and who later reached for that vocabulary when he wanted to talk about what lasts and what doesn't. That possibility wasn't in my curriculum. And I wonder now, how many things like that weren't in my curriculum because the textbooks had already decided what kind of life Jesus led before anyone thought to look at what the ground actually contained. And here's the thing that sits with me most heavily. That student's question was a good question. A genuinely good, curious, historically alert question from a teenager in a Catholic school in Indiana who was paying attention. And I answered it with something true but incomplete because I didn't have the information he deserved. I have no idea what happened to that student. I don't even remember his name clearly. I think it was Marcus, or maybe Michael. One of those names that's common enough in the memory to blur with other faces from 12 years of teaching. But I think about his questions sometimes. I think about how it took me another 20 years of independent research to get to the place where I could answer it properly. That is what I mean when I say I was wrong in a consequential way. Not dramatically, not in a way that ruined anyone's life, but in the quiet, accumulated way that a teacher who presents incomplete information as complete is wrong, by shaping the questions students think are worth asking and the ones they never think to ask at all. This is the part I didn't expect, the part I should say out loud even though it's uncomfortable. I wasn't just misinformed about the house. I was teaching a version of history that had a specific shape, a shape designed to support a specific theology. And I was presenting that shape as neutral fact. The absolute poverty of the Holy Family is a theological argument that has been made since at least the 4th century. God became incarnate in the most vulnerable possible circumstances as a statement about divine solidarity with the poor and the powerless. That is a serious argument. It has serious implications. Serious theologians have made it seriously. But it is not the same argument as, and we know this because the archaeological evidence shows that 1st century Nazareth produced only hovels and dirt floors. Because the archaeological evidence does not show that, the archaeological evidence shows stone courtyard houses on carved bedrock, limestone vessels, skilled labor, proximity to a major construction project 4 miles away, a specific house in Capernaum transformed into a place of worship within decades of the crucifixion by people who had reason to believe they knew what that place was. What the evidence shows about economic status is genuinely complicated, not wealthy, not destitute, artisan class, a family with a skilled trade in a region where that trade was in demand with enough stability to build in stone, the tekton family. And then there is Capernaum, where someone within living memory of Jesus' death turned a private house into a place of worship and kept worshiping there, and the Christians who came after them kept worshiping there, and the Byzantines eventually built a martyrium over it. The continuity of that practice is, to me, the piece of evidence that is hardest to explain away. You can debate the identification of the Nazareth house. Kendark himself is careful about certainty. But the Capernaum transformation is not a later tradition mapped onto a vague memory. It is a physical transformation of a specific building, datable within decades of the events, in the exact location where multiple independent sources say the events occurred. I don't know exactly how to sit with that. I'm not sure I've finished sitting with it. There is something else I want to name, though. Something that is less about the archaeology and more about the pattern the archaeology reveals. I have heard the counter-argument. I have read it in comment sections, and I have seen it made seriously by people who are genuinely trying to be careful about historical claims. The counter-argument goes something like this. Of course they found stone houses in Nazareth. That's what people built there. It doesn't mean Jesus' family specifically was comfortable. It doesn't mean anything about their economic status specifically. And that counter-argument is not entirely wrong. But here's what it misses. The argument being challenged is not, stone houses existed in Nazareth. Of course they did. The argument being challenged is the specific claim, presented in textbooks, reinforced by iconography, never marked as theological interpretation rather than historical fact, that the Holy Family lived in absolute destitution, in conditions of extreme poverty that set them apart from even the basic housing standards of their time and place. That is the claim that the archaeology complicates, because the housing standard of first-century Nazareth for an artisan family with a skilled trade appears to have included stone courtyard houses built on carved bedrock. That is what the Sisters of Nazareth site shows. That is what Ken Dark documented. And there is the question of the tekton. If your textbook described a carpenter and you pictured a small workshop, a craft trade, a man making furniture, that picture has been shaping the imagination of millions of readers for centuries. The picture of the skilled stonemason operating near a major urban construction project 4 miles away is a different picture. Same word, different picture. The word is tekton. The picture changes depending on what you know. Spinoza, thinking about what it means to encounter historical evidence that disturbs a prior belief, wrote something I've come back to: that the mind that is unwilling to be changed by evidence has already decided that its conclusions matter more than its process. I'm paraphrasing badly, but the point holds. The question is not whether the house exists or what it proves. The question is whether you're willing to let physical evidence complicate a picture that was simpler and more theologically convenient than the ground actually supports. Because I want to name something that I think is worth naming. The Spinoza Forever Library. 5 volumes that explore this exact intersection between historical evidence and received belief is linked in the description below and in the pinned comment. It's the kind of resource that belongs next to this kind of investigation. Not an answer. A deeper set of questions. Here's what I am left with after going through all of this. The house in Nazareth, the one the Sisters of Nazareth Convent accidentally preserved under their building while doing routine maintenance in the 1880s, the one that Ken Dark spent decades carefully analyzing and publishing in 2021 and 2023, is a real structure. A first-century Jewish courtyard house built in stone on carved bedrock with evidence of an observant Jewish household. A candidate, a serious, archaeologically defensible candidate for the childhood home of Jesus. The house in Capernaum, under the octagonal Byzantine church on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, excavated by Corbo in 1969 and documented by Lofreda in 1985, is a real structure. A first-century private house converted into a public Christian gathering space within living memory of the crucifixion, with early devotional inscriptions on its plastered walls, venerated continuously for 4 centuries before a major architectural martyrium was built to formalize what was already being practiced there. Neither of these structures has an inscription proving the identification. Good archaeology doesn't pretend otherwise. But what they do have together is a picture of a life lived in a material world that is very different from the one I was teaching. A household with a skilled trade, a house made of stone, a base of operations in Capernaum substantial enough for a specific community to identify it, transform it, and venerate it without interruption for 400 years. The iconography of extreme poverty that I taught as historical background is not archaeological fact. It is theological argument rendered as devotional art. Both of those things can be true at the same time. The theological argument can be serious and meaningful, and the historical house can have been made of well-cut stone. But I think the conflation, presenting the theological interpretation as historical background, without marking the difference, does something specific. It removes agency. It flattens the question. It makes it seem like the only interesting thing about Jesus' life is its poverty, rather than the much more complicated and interesting truth that a skilled craftsman's son from a working artisan household in Galilee walked out of that stone house, and a courtyard house in Capernaum became a church within living memory of his death, and that specific house stayed a church for 4 centuries. That is not the story of someone who was invisible. That is not the story of a destitute peasant who left no trace. That is the story of someone who left a trace in stone. And now, every time I see the traditional nativity iconography, the rough stable, the dirt floor, the absolute poverty rendered in gold leaf on a medieval altarpiece, I see something I cannot unsee. I see the theological argument dressed as historical context. I see the image that replaced the stone house in the imagination of 2,000 years of Christianity. And I understand why the image was made, and I understand the theology it was trying to express, and I cannot go back to the moment before I understood the difference. That is the price of this kind of investigation. You don't get to unknow it. You learn to carry it. I'll let you sit with that. What do you make of it? Does the archaeological evidence change anything for you, or does it complicate something you were comfortable with? I'd be curious to read your thoughts in the comments, especially if you think I've drawn a conclusion that the evidence doesn't actually support. That's a fair pushback, and I mean it. Before you go, if this investigation moved something in you, even slightly, there's a way to help this work continue. A super thanks tells YouTube's system that this type of deep investigation is worth supporting, and it directly funds the research time that goes into these videos. I've been at this for years now, since before I knew it would become this. The investigation deserves to be sustainable. If you feel that, you know how to make it count. And if you're the type of person who can't let an idea go until you understand it from every angle, this channel was built for you. Subscribe and let the algorithm know. That's it. That's the question.